Now, this morning so far, what we have heard is pretty much a helicopter view of the new financial architecture in the making. So what we're going to do now in this panel is that we're going to dive down and scoop in on one of the segments, investment products. But it's actually a very important segment because you are talking about products that could actually access and therefore affect tens of millions of investors. And as the world is now moving into the matured and aging space in terms of population, clearly products and their returns are very important factors. So what we are going to be talking about today in this panel is about product oversight and governance process. Now, this is actually nothing new, but it's now all of a sudden converged on the regulator's table. But before we start, let me quickly introduce my panel members. Greg, you don't need an introduction. You've heard him this morning. Andrew, he is the Executive Director and Head of Global Markets in Hang Seng Bank, which, as you know, is a big local product issuer as well as a product distributor. Edouard is the Managing Director in AMF, the French regulator. Edouard is responsible for, among other things, regulatory policy. Dan is now the Managing Director of ICI Global, which is an institution for global asset managers. But before that, Dan was with the FSA, and he was telling me that years before, in the dark, distant memories, he was with the CFTC. So here we are. Now, first of all, product oversight and governance is very simple. It's about ensuring that products that are manufactured are created with a target market in mind, and the products are designed to achieve fair outcomes to meet the investment objectives of that target market. So in other words, issuers don't just go around creating products that they like to create or that they like to sell, but instead they create products that the market really needs to buy. Now, as I said earlier, this is nothing new because all issuers, when they create products, they will have to go through an internal product committee and product process. So why is it that all of a sudden regulators around the world have now converged on bringing product design and governance within their regulatory radar and putting these principles squarely on the table as being principles that require the industry to focus on and to comply with? Now, maybe I should quickly ask Greg to fill us in on this background, because I think that would be a nice way to start. So, Greg, if you could very briefly, tell us why and how we got here.
Well, look, I think, Alexa, that the traditional reliance on conduct and disclosure, clearly with the last crisis, I think we really did, in relation particularly to disclosure, I think that we were challenged. And I think that, as we've seen with the mini bonds or whatever, for example, in Hong Kong, clearly products were frankly too complex often for investors to understand what they were buying. And I think that's really made us think about really looking beyond just disclosure as the tool in which to make sure that investors are getting the right product. And that's why, in fact, I think now you're seeing regulators around the world looking very much more at the whole value chain, not just the point of sale of the product. So I think that is the new, the new place where we are. The UK and Europe and IOSCO have done a lot of work in relation to that. The UK just in 2012 they had their retail product development and governance review, and basically identified that encouraging product providers to actually have product approval procedures that are reviewed regularly, to identify, and I think this is really important, to identify the target market that you're actually looking at to sell a product to. And back to what Ashley said earlier, thinking about behavioural science and about how the people in that target market make decisions. And if, you know, basically, if it's a target market where they're not going to understand the product, then frankly, you shouldn't be targeting the product to that market. And I think the other issue is also in the design implementation of products, particularly complex products, making sure that you're appropriately stress tested so that basically the product does hopefully perform as expected, and that, you know, basically, you know, the investors are reasonably protected. So stress testing and modelling is absolutely critical, and sharing that is absolutely is also absolutely critical. So I think, you know, the actual new product approval process is actually now, I think, absolutely essential. And I do think, though, if you think about the basic concept of disclosure, disclosure is a very good tool, but I think we've got to rethink disclosure, because, you know, the concept is that it should be clear, concise. And I think the focus on clear, concise, you know, we've worked on for a long time, but I think we've got a lot more thinking to do about the effective. And I think if you think about it, it's the effective of where the problem is. And if, for example, if they don't read prospectuses, then, you know, basically the clear and concise actually doesn't really matter. So I think the word, I think now, is, you know, what is effective disclosure? And also effective disclosure also means comprehension.
Right. So anyway, from a layman's perspective, it's all very good, because the product governance principles, basically, it makes a lot of sense. It requires the issuers to have in place robust processes, make sure that the products are designed with the objective of delivering fair outcomes to that target group, and therefore, there are real responsibilities if you fail to do that. Now, however, there are jurisdictions that pre-vet, and there are jurisdictions that do not pre-vet. France and Hong Kong, for instance, pre-vet the offering documents, but Australia and the UK, for instance, do not. So with respect to product governance, for those jurisdictions that pre-vet, it doesn't mean that the regulator actually now goes behind the whole process. And at each stage of the decision-making in the process, the regulator then asks the issuer, well, what have you done? Are you sure this is the right answer? That is not what the regulator is supposed to do. But at the end of the day, it is still a process in there to remind the issuer that, as Greg says, when you bring out a product, you really have to have the target audience in mind and make sure that your product is designed fairly for them. But then the problem then arises for those jurisdictions that pre-vet, because then there might be a danger of the public saying, oh, because you have pre-vetted that product, so you must have gone through the process and you must have been satisfied that the product meets every stage of the process in a reasonable kind of way. For instance, the product delivers a stated rate of return, and the investor may assume that before you approve, you would actually go in and ask the issuer the question, well, is this rate of return reasonable? Is it too high or is it too low? So let me put that question first to Edouard, and then the rest of my members who do not believe in pre-vetting, you may have something to say after that. But Edouard, you know, France has a pre-vetting regime. So what is your view on this?
Thank you, Alexa, and thanks for inviting me. This is a very interesting question indeed. The first remark on that first is that pre-vetting exists, but there is no level playing field between the products for which you pre-vet in many, many countries. For instance, in Europe, you may have a very different degree of approval or pre-vetting, as you say, depending on the legal wrapper. You don't do the same when you deal with UCITS funds than when you did with prospectus products such as bonds or MTNs or even other products. So this is the first problem. And people don't realize when they buy a product that, for instance, in certain cases, they have some information about how the product will be built, for instance, for funds, because they know there are limits, there is diversification of risk, eligibility rules, but for the products which do exactly the same job, they don't have the same protection at all. This is my first remark. Then to answer more directly your question, the problem is that now we're coming to a very important point, which is the responsibilities among the various actors in the chain. What is the responsibility of the investors, of the manufacturer and distributor, and the responsibility of the regulator? And in terms of responsibility of the client, the final client, the end user, you need to keep a part of responsibility on those persons. Why? Because you need those persons to take risk and to choose their own risk when they buy a product. So you need to find a balance between a certain level of protection and sufficient information to enable those people to make their choice. And this is, in my opinion, the most important point. This is where the word complexity or intelligibility of the product, in my opinion, is maybe the most important one. We don't want to limit the risks that people take when they buy certain products. We don't want that, because we need people buying basic stocks, for instance, for financing their own retirement schemes and financing dependency, old age, and so on and so forth, and for the financing of the economy at large. The problem is we don't want those people to buy products they don't understand. And so one of the things which is not clear at all today is the definition of what is too complex or not intelligible enough for the retail investors. And I think when we talk about pre-vetting, when we talk about product governance or design or manufacturing, before saying, okay, we need to target the people we want to distribute the products to, first, we need to have a good approach of what is intelligibility of the product for the retail sector. Why do we insist on that in the AMF in France? Because you have so many different interpretations of complexity in the world and even in Europe that if you don't have a basic philosophy on that, it will be impossible to converge. Even in Europe today, to give you an example, you have a definition of complexity which is based on can you sell the products on a simple execution mode without giving advice and without doing the appropriateness test to your client. You can have another interpretation which is there are too many derivatives or complex techniques in it, securities lending or repos. Or the third interpretation that we have, which is to be considered as non-complex, a product should have a risk-reward profile that is intelligible. I don't say who is right or wrong. Simply, if we don't agree on that, and you can see that in certain texts in Europe we don't agree on that, it will be very difficult to agree on product governance and design because we don't start from the same point. Maybe a last issue by way of introduction. Also, in terms of responsibilities, it's good to go towards more product governance because there are so many different wrappers that giving a minimum set of product governance and design for those which have not will make them closer, for instance, to the UCITS wrapper, to the Fung wrapper. But this is not the end of the story at all. We need to make a lot of progress on this in terms of level playing field across the range of products. Of course, I'm talking about financial instruments such as funds, bonds, and so on. Of course, insurance products. And the level playing field issue will be also very important. This is my last point, because without this level playing field, the very nature of those products when they are sold in third countries, you cannot intervene in the same way when you're in an open economy than when you are in a closed economy. In a closed economy, you have the control of the design and manufacturing of the product. So you can say, okay, it's in the product design, it's the product governance. In Europe, for instance, we have internal passports. So you cannot control what another country is doing about the product. So when you say pre-vetting, actually we pre-vet in the sense that we say what kind of marketing material is good or not. And why are we doing that? Just because we're obliged to do it, because we don't have the right to criticize or to say the product is not good. So let me finish on that, but I think two important words which need to be understood in the same manner by all the regulators. First, complexity and or intelligibility, and second, level playing field.
Right, okay, Dan, I saw you looking at me when Edouard was making the comment about in Europe, you can't really, other products created elsewhere could actually come into your market. Now, you come from the UK. UK, of course, is part of the EU. and the UK doesn't have a pre-vetting regime. What is the UK experience with respect to like complex products that come into the market and investors' understanding and the whole chain of events?
Let me respond to that, Alexa, but let me say a few words of introduction, if I might. I hope you can all hear me. I gather it's a bit difficult. We're supposed to be talking into our mic like that, which is rather annoying, I'm sure, to you and to me. But the first thing to say, I think, is basically I'm coming from the point of view of the long-only global buy side here. This organization, ICI Global, which may not be known to you, we don't represent hedge funds or private equity. We're talking about the regulated investment market. The level playing field point that Edouard has mentioned is hugely important in this context. And in that world, it's very interesting to observe the development of these principles of product design and product intervention at global level have been focused on structured products and on complex products. We, the members of ICI Global, live in a world that is regulated and full of pre-vetted products, and products that are designed with features that protect investors, that limit and provide a horizon on the kinds of risks to which they are exposed, that have deep requirements about diversification and limits on leverage, and all kinds of features like that, which mean to yield a kind of a reasonably safe, but also hopefully profitable investor experience. Enter the world then of the non-level playing field, where structured products and in many cases insurance products can be produced in a completely different manner, sold to the very same people, and often competing directly in terms of the asset classes or the kinds of investments to which investors are exposed. That is why ICI Global, first of all, welcomes the PRIPS initiative in Europe, is very concerned about its fate. It doesn't seem to have gone very well. A lot of pushback from insurance, and may even say on this platform, insurance regulators, to a more harmonized approach. The structured product world, a very important, the chief executive of a very large asset manager owned by a bank in a country whose regulator is sitting quite close to me, said his biggest competition comes from his bank parent, and you will all understand why that is so. So the level playing field is hugely important. We are very supportive, actually, of the work on product design that has been done here. And in fact, although many of our members do not produce structured products, some do. The interesting point, though, is that the governance arrangements around product design and the processes and the people involved, it's usually a unitary process. So what's happening, in fact, is these principles of product design, I now come back to the UK, finally, Alexa. These principles of product design, in fact, are being applied more generally on the creation of products, including things like UCITS, whether structured or not. And the questions are being legitimately asked, saying, is the investor at the heart of your product design arrangements? This, to us, is a sensible question. And we welcome, frankly, the introduction of some structure, particularly in the non-regulated product space, in the structured product space, in the complex space, because frankly, so many of the other protections are just not there, and the competitive level playing field is also not there. The UK experience has been pretty fraught in some respects. Indeed, Hong Kong has had its own little issues with complex products and things that turned out to be rather different from what investors thought they might be. Whether you then say to yourselves that we want to enter a world where the regulator not only pre-vets things, but also exercises powers to prevent the sale of products is something we probably ought to speak about. And there has been some relevant experience about that in the UK, which I can turn to now or perhaps later, Alexa.
We can talk about product intervention and banning later on after we have fully explored the whole spectrum of the design process in the upper quartile.
Yes.
But Edward made a point which I thought was an excellent point, and which is we are not about restricting products, the scope of products that can come to the market. That's not the right approach, because investors should be given as broad a choice as possible. But we are not, this is about making sure that when complex products come in, investors understand what is the complexity, what is the product, and whether it is a product that they is in their horizon and they need to buy. And as Greg mentioned earlier, the twin approach of clear disclosure and point of sale suitability requirement, they do not seem to have to be working as well as we all thought they were working. So regulators around the world have had to think about what other things have to be brought in order to assist the process so that products are, one, designed fairly for the target audience, and two, the target audience will get a wide choice of the stuff that is suitable for them. But that brings me to my next question, and that is, with this product design process, you're not just talking about the initial stage before the product is launched. As Greg mentioned earlier, you're talking about the whole product cycle. So in fact, you are requiring, or we are requiring, the issuer, after they have sent the product to market, they would also need to continue to monitor the product to make sure that it is performing in the way that it was originally designed to perform for the benefit of that target market investor. So for Dan and for Andrew, who represent the market and the industry, I'd like to hear your views as to how you see you could actually go on with this continuous monitoring process. Andrew, for instance, you have lots of products in the market. So what do? You have a whole team of people, or I mean, how do you manage that?
Well, basically, since 2009,
Andrew, you have to speak louder.
we are trying to cut the amount of products we are carrying. For bikes, my example is I used to carry as an open architecture distribution, not just a manufacturer. I used to carry 500 funds in our platform, and now my target is 250 in order to keep track and my investors well informed. So probably you investor probably will see less what they used to see, but of course it's probably some kind of improvement. I think pre-vetting or whatsoever is some pros and cons. It's really, if a product is 10 years, pre-vetting is really unrealistic. AAA can become double B in 2 years' time or 3 years' time,
Yes, we know that.
and manufacturers can leave this job to others already. So still, the distributors are facing their customers, and they have to monitor. Actually, the customers' risk profile all can change. If he buy a product at 50, when he or she is 60, his own risk profile change. So I think that pre-rating or continuous monitoring the product by the manufacturer, anything beyond 2 or 3 years is really unrealistic. And also in Hong Kong's example, I think SFC have done a very good job, and actually Greg and Morris, we're going to know him, that you guys come from the market. If you want to monitor pre-vet a product, you probably have to, the regulators have to have people come and go, so you understand the market. I can, as a market participant, I really do not anticipate a career regulator to pre-vet. So of course in Hong Kong it's a very fair game. We hire some of your guys, and you also hire some of our guys. So I think, and
I think it happens anyway.
Yeah, but anyway, just a joke. We hire high-paid guys. You hire our low-paid guys. So when they train up, we hire back our high-paid guys. It's a good rotation.
Maybe you need to reverse the trade.
Yeah, but I think to some extent, pre-vetting will prevent or mitigate the conflict between the distributor and manufacturers. But that can create a moral hazard between regulators and the manufacturer. So I think there's always pros and cons, but I think pivoting must go with the regulators must be professional in terms of knowing what we are doing, and you can, I do not know, because most of the regulators cannot buy any product. So if so, are you really looking at the full angle of investors? So
that's
I
right.
think
They
there's
say
pros
that
and
you
cons.
have to have personal experience. We don't, because we're not supposed to buy any of the products that we authorize.
Unfortunately.
Are you sure it's a good idea?
Actually, can I just make a comment, Alex? I do think that we're in a new paradigm these days. I think that post-crisis, I think it's gone from basically almost investor beware to manufacturer beware. Sorry, I was just saying, I think we have a new paradigm that we have, I think, moved from a paradigm where it was pretty much investor beware to now it's manufacturer beware or distributor beware. And I think that's a global phenomena. And no matter what you think, what I think we discovered after the crisis is that the courts or the legislature, if something that is completely inappropriate, they will rule against you. So I think the days of sort of being comfortable that you've ticked all the boxes legally, I think they've changed. They've changed for good. And I think you saw that in Australia where the courts held councils and not-for-profits have bought CDOs. They held the manufacturer and the distributor and the rating agency liable. We had the mini bonds here, we had Belgium, we had PPI in the UK. It was like, and that, you know, how far is that going back, haunting those institutions? So I think we are in a new world. And I think back to product governance, I think to what Andrew said, it's a brand new world. Very brand new world. I don't think it's going to go back.
Dan?
I think I want to respond to what Greg has said, and I think there are examples, certainly in the UK, there are examples elsewhere of products that probably oughtn't to have been sold, or oughtn't to have been sold for as long as they were, or oughtn't to have been sold to as many people. It's very easy to look back at PPI and say we being the FSA and when I was there, we ought to have stopped it. And then you say to yourself, what is the evidence, what is the analytical framework that a regulator would adopt to stop something before it goes wrong? It's not the same analysis as looking back and seeing, look what happened, it's terrible. It's sitting at the front end of it before there's damage and deciding we're going to step in and prevent. And I think that is a very, very difficult job for a regulator to engage in. I would expect it to be rare. I can think of one case in the UK just a few years ago when the FSA, issued basically a warning in respect of a particular kind of product, which is a really interesting bond type product, not regulated, of course, as a UCITS or anything like that, which was basically packaging life insurance policies of certain types of people with particular death profiles, if you like, and selling them to retail investors. And the FSA took the view that looking at the pricing, looking at the complexity, looking at the likely target audience, not a good idea, and essentially shut that market. But those kinds of situations, I think, at least in the experience of most of us, are pretty rare. And the idea that the regulator is going to be kind of regularly in the business of saying yes, yes, no, no, yes, this to us is not the right place to end up. And I don't think Edouard is talking about that at all. I don't think that, Greg, you are either. The governance issues then become, and the monitoring, because you did ask that question, Alexa. In fact, speaking to the members of ICI Global, it is clear that the ongoing monitoring of one's product is part of the paradigm. It's part of the way the management process goes. The next question you ask yourself is, should the regulator get in there and say, okay, how often? What does it have to look like? And get prescriptive about it. Then I think we would push back on that, because the variety of products, the variety of market circumstances, the way these things perform is highly variable. And it seems to us that in the judgment of the manager and of the firm, comes the choice of saying how frequently, in what kind of depth does one do that examination. The more complex the product, the more variable its dependence is upon changes of circumstances, probably the more intense that kind of monitoring needs to become to ensure you haven't just kind of completely gone off the rails. But we're not looking, I think, for a lot of prescription. The other point I think I need to make is, and we've been touched on, the complexity of the value chain. The manufacturers today, in many, many cases, do not know where that product is going to end up and who's going to end up owning it in an individual case. And you're not going to be able to get that information because your distribution is not going to give it to you, are you, Andrew? So that's reality. So the idea of a target market, yes. The idea that you oversee your own distribution and make sure they understand your product, absolutely. The idea that you are then responsible for something that goes wrong on an advised basis at the end of the chain, no. This is not acceptable. And it sort of runs contra to the whole regulation of the interface between the investor and the advisor. Because at the end of the day, an investor who's in your target market may not be a suitable person to buy it. It may not be the risk profile that they want. It may not be the part of the portfolio that they need. Those decisions are individual decisions. They are not design decisions. And I think it's really important that product design regulatory frameworks do not then bleed into the abolition of suitability and the substitution of responsibility on the advisors for the manufacturer.
Right. Okay. We should come back to that. In fact, what we have discussed so far tells us that there is actually a big spectrum. At the one end of the spectrum is the complete caveat emptor. So it's pure disclosure, but with disclosure, we will add on the suitability requirements so that the right product gets sold to the right kind of people. Now, at the far end of the spectrum is the full pre-vetting regime. I don't think any of us has the full pre-vetting regime in the full sense of that word. Edouard has just explained how it's done in France. And in Hong Kong, as you all know, we pre-vet the disclosure. So to the extent that we make a merit judgment, it's on whether or not we believe that the disclosure is clear and is full, right? And on top of that, of course, we then rely on, again, the suitability requirement. So that's the whole gamut of it. But regulators have now introduced into that spectrum, somewhere in between, not as far out as pre-vetting, but closer to that than the caveat emptor, and which is the product banning, which Dan alluded to earlier. So using the FSA's term, at that time it was FSA, but now it's the FCA, they basically say that they want to be able to get in there and to prevent detriment before it actually arrives. So using those terms, I'd like to put the question to my fellow members as to whether or not they think that the product banning process would actually be able to help regulators prevent the kind of detriment. And I put the question first to Greg, because I know Australia it doesn't have a pre-vetting regime, but to an extent you have something in a sense that you can stop a document being offered if you believe that the disclosures in them are not correct or they are misleading.
That's correct. I mean, we can take action to force a prospectus to be withdrawn, but basically if that misleading deceptive disclosure is corrected, then they can come back into the market. But in terms of the whole debate on intervention, I guess my view comes back to the basic principle, which is investors need to take responsibility for their own investment decisions. And we will help them with financial literacy, etc. But I do think we've got to be very careful on that. And clearly we'll hold gatekeepers to account, which is something we do, and thinking about consumer behaviour. But I do think there is this balance between investors taking responsibility for their own investment decisions, and when you, on the other hand, making sure that you actually facilitate innovation in the market, I think is really important. Secondly, that I think it's important that you try and, those investors that do understand products and where they're very complex, that they can have the opportunity to buy them. And then thirdly, I think that the thing that troubles me with the product vetting, product intervention, is really the enormous moral hazard that it brings.
Right.
The moral hazard is gigantic. So it's, you know, from the investor perspective, they take the view, well, you know, for example, say in my case, ASIC, you know, oh, ASIC's looked at that, so it should be safe. And I can't count how many times we get investors coming to us and said, oh, I had no idea what I was buying, but I thought you were watching it. It's like, well, yeah, we're like 2000's $1 trillion market. So, you know, I do think it's an enormous moral hazard. And also, the other part of moral hazard is clearly for regulators that, you know, particular product, if you even have a product intervention power, you know, actually what it means is that you've got to be scanning the market for any potential problem products at all times, and if something goes wrong, they go, well, why didn't you intervene? So I do think that there is enormous moral hazard risk there. And also, I think there's a resource issue, which is, you know, having the resources to scan the market for products. Trying to micromanage a market is actually very difficult. So I've had a change of view on product intervention. When I first heard about the UK as power, I thought, oh, I wouldn't mind one of those. But what do they say in life? It's not what you shouldn't, what you wish for, mate, worrying about the alternative. So, you know, I've had I think I have a different reflection that I think, you know, it's always the thing about a regulator. If you have information or you have power, sometimes that provides a problem in itself if you can't use that information or you don't have the resources to use that, or both, resources or information. So in some respects you've got to think carefully about being given more information or more power, because you actually could be setting yourself up or setting up the wrong expectations. So I think, but again, we'll comment perhaps on the next topic where I think there is more to think about in terms of you know, investor understanding and competition. I do think we haven't got it yet in terms of disclosure, frankly.
Right, okay. I'm going to ask the next question put the next question to Dan. Now, you referred to product intervention earlier a couple of times. In the UK, you have that power. I believe the UK was the first one to actually come out with that proposal. And I remember back then, I asked them for the philosophy, and they said, well, you know, in our market, we cannot stop products from coming in from all over the EU, and some of those products, you know, God knows how complex they are. So we need to have a power so that in the exigent circumstance, we can actually go out there and stop that product being sold, so that we arrest the horse before it bolts, so to speak. Now, but then, once you have that power, then the moral hazard issue comes in. Couldn't an investor then come to you and say, gee, you know, I bought this product. Why didn't you go out there and ban it before it came to me? So can you actually share with us, to the extent you can, whether the UK has had any kind of experience like that?
Well, that power is a new power. I just want to say that I completely agree with everything that Greg has said. And actually, sometimes you ask for things that maybe you don't want to actually be given. It will be interesting to see whether, in fact, the FCA is able to achieve the very laudable goal of preventing things from bad things from happening. You can't disagree with the philosophy. You cannot, actually. But when you look at reality and you look at life and you say to yourself, the point that I made earlier, what is the set of circumstances in which you can confidently deploy a power like that prevents action or prevents things from being sold? There have been problems in the UK. Key data is the most famous one. The wrapping of a product approved in another European jurisdiction, the sale, advised sale on very poor advice to many investors who ended up owning something that was very damaging, very costly. Remuneration, compensation was then paid, including by many fund managers who had nothing to do with the creation of that product. Not a lot of happy people about that outcome. So one of the pleas, I would say, from coming from members of ICI Global to regulators talking about product design and talking about intervention is consistency, please. It's not a great situation, even within Europe, where you have wide divergence of what regulators think is okay and what isn't. Because actually, at the end of the day, when things can cross borders freely, then you're kind of on the receiving end of things that are unfortunate. So, you know, while we welcome some of this thinking, consistency is really important. Happy to see that IOSCO's engaged in this again, because our members are dealing on a global level. So, you know, if countries have 25 different versions of what's an acceptable product design regulatory framework, this is not a sensible place to land, I think.
Right, I'm gonna move over to Edouard. Now, the joint statement from the EU regulatory authorities, they talk about product design, but I don't think they've gone as far as product intervention. But we understand that ESMA has been looking into that. So I'd like to hear, I'm sure the audience would love to hear your view, both wearing your hat as part of the EU and also from the perspective of France. How do you look at this?
First, I must say I fully agree with what Dan said. We have a problem in Europe because it's already difficult when you are alone, when you are 27 or 28, and if you do different things in terms of regulating the products, you have another problem. So what we are trying to do, and actually what is into PRIPS that you mentioned, and MiFID II, that has just been approved at political level a few days ago, is precisely an attempt to answer to your different question. What do we have in MiFID II plus PRIPS if it survives under, I would say, an acceptable form, which is not obvious? First, yes, you have some product intervention, and coming back to your question, these are more exceptional powers in certain circumstances, both for systemic or anti-systemic purposes, but also for a certain product. But it's a first step, it's an exception, both at national and ESMA level. Then you have some kind of product governance, only governance, processes, nothing about the design itself, because the design would have been much more difficult. But again, in some products, you have some design limits, and in some others, you don't have. So some product intervention, but limited, a bit more product governance. And why are we entering into this field? Because precisely what we did before was to try to do it through either the UK way, which is with a certain specific power, or through the monitoring and control of the marketing practices, which was the choice we made because we had also a different legal analysis, which was with the single market, you cannot just ban the product of somebody else. And for instance, Greg mentioned that, well, we have a power on the prospectus. When you deal with the prospectus of the product yourself, yes, to some extent, but legally, you have something to do. You need to remain in the limits of your remit because it's very precise. But when it's somebody else's job, another regulator's job, to check that the prospectus is good or not, for us, so far, our understanding was that it was only possible to do something at the distribution level. And so coming back to the architecture we are trying to put in place, which is not easy. What are we trying to do? First, some product intervention, including with a start at European level. Second, some product governance. It is only the start of the story. I don't know what will happen in MiFID III, but it's very clear that at some point in time, there will be a discussion as to whether there should be more convergence between the different legal wrappers, such as UCITS on the one hand and prospectus for bonds on the other. Then, what are the other responsibilities of the manufacturer, of the designer? There is another one which is very important, which changes everything, which is the famous key ID, the key information document. I don't say that the key ID is perfect, but it's done by the manufacturer, not by the distributor, and it's under the responsibility of the producer, not the regulator and not the distributor. So the famous simple document that we want so that retail investors understand the product, it's the responsibility of the manufacturer, which is very, very important. And then, of course, you have all the responsibilities and liabilities of people at the end of the chain, which are the advisors and the distributors, which still have their work to do when it comes to advising their clients, appropriateness tests, suitability tests, and so on. So the balance that is now coming out of all those texts is quite good. Of course, it will need to be refined over time, but having those responsibilities between the prospectus, the key ID. By the way, if you have key ID for bonds or stocks in the future, maybe the key ID will replace the so-called simplified prospectus, which is even longer than the previous one, which may be a good idea. This is a good start. And then last point, it's far from being perfect. And again, I agree completely with Dan on the fact that one thing is missing, it's the ambition in PRIPS, in the packaged retail investment products text, because at the outset there was a decision by the European Commission to say, okay, we will just deal with the point of sale disclosure and the key ID in PRIPS, and we will deal with marketing and distribution practices in different legal wrappers. First, MiFID for true financial instruments and IMD for insurance products. And you know that there is still discussion in Europe. Fortunately, at the end of MiFID II, okay, it's far from being perfect, but we have a recital that says, okay, in MiFID, you have those rules for MiFID products, limits to inducements, definition of complex products, and so on. And the recital, it says, okay, you need to do the same in IMD, that is for insurance products, when this text is ready. So it's far from being perfect. I won't recall all the balance between these various tools, but what we are creating in Europe, which is not an example for everyone, but it attempts to create the right balance between the responsibilities of the various actors in the chain. And again, if the information, if the disclosure is good and simple, normally you can push much more of the responsibility on the investors. And if you have a good key ID and a good delineation between producer through governance and key ID and distributor through advice and suitability test, then you have a much better world.
Right, so it's really a case of responsibility and who's taking what. Now, let me move to Andrew. As an issuer, you have just heard what Greg says. The paradigm has changed, so it's not business as usual. You will have to expect your regulator asking more questions, and there will be more requirements. However, as a distributor, the product design and also the product intervention powers might actually help you, or might it not? I'd like to hear your views.
Well, it's a mix. First, I would rather say for the last 5 to 7 years is the hard work of the regulators, distributor and manufacturers that final investors or individuals, at least in Hong Kong, are moving from saying no risk, no risk, high return. Now they say, what's the least return I can have higher return? I think actually this is the difference between now and the pre-Lehman period, which is a good progress among three of us. Now I think that overall, if you look at what is now is banks or distributors are moving to identical products for the 5 years against the pre-Lehman Brothers period. Structured notes customized to individual customers probably will be 40% of the market, and funds will be 60%. But now you see identical fund products will be 80% of the market. And coming back to Edouard's statement, I think if really product intervention happen, then retail investors will see less and less customized products, because the moral hazard to call a product with 1 million investor against 5,000 investors is very different from regulators, I think. So, and to this extent, I do not have the balance. If you look at Hong Kong for the last few years, small investors are really, well, they get better protected, but also they are being hurt by seeing less products. There's very few retail bonds coming into the market nowadays because the document is so clumsy and you have really good large corporates, which they can issue to institutional investors with 2 pages, will not come to the retail market again. And so I think we are moving, we are trying to get a balance. And in Hong Kong's case, I think we are moving. But still, for small investors, they still give and take. They get better protections, but they are giving up. They are being, they give up some opportunities because of the consideration. If there's really active product intervention, I think the chance of small investors seeing more, higher yield but lesser risk product will be less and less, and distributors will come to identical products.
Yes, that clearly is an issue that we all need to be very, very much aware of. And that actually goes back to the earlier point that Edouard made about it's not about restricting the scope of products that come to market. It is about getting investors to understand. And that actually brings us to a very interesting concept, which I just got the first question from the audience. And this person says, we've been focusing a lot on mis-selling, but then what about mis-buying? Yep. I mean, there are many investors out there who purchase products, and then when the going is good, it's all fine, but then as soon as it goes south, they come and say, but you know, I didn't understand, this is not what I bought, etc., etc. Now, so in the equation, we've been talking about responsibility being taken by the responsible party. So clearly, as an investor, you also have the responsibility of taking charge of your own investment decisions, albeit that these decisions should be made on a clear basis, on a clear set of facts that are not misleading, and you know, they're full and clear. So, Greg, I understand that in Australia, you have on foot a mechanism or a measure that you're working on, which will actually get investors to really sit down and analyze a product and analyze their own risk profile in order to assess whether or not this is a product for them. So maybe you could share that, you know, your thinking with us, because I think that will be very interesting for this audience.
Yep. Look, you know, having been a manufacturer and now being a regulator, don't laugh, Andrew. But it really makes, I've sort of seen both sides of the equation. And I think at the same time, you know, I think you're making sure that investors do take responsibility themselves. But also I think behavioural science, thinking about how people take decisions. But also I think we have a fabulous opportunity these days with basically technology. And we all know that the future lies in mobile, in video and in networks. And I think, you know, pulling all that together, I think there's an opportunity for a win for manufacturers and also for investors. So what we're piloting, and we are going to be looking at piloting very soon for simple CIS, is basically moving to, first of all, dealing with the overloaded information, is just simply asking for a key fact statement of 2 pages on a product, optionally allowing the rest of information to be provided online, optionally. And then as part of that, what we're going to require is that investors, and it's also addressing this issue, is that many products are bought without advice. They're execution only. They might be bought online and there's no advice. So basically what we're going to ask is that there actually be an investor self-assessment, optional investor self-assessment module that is available online to investors when they are about to buy a product. They have the 2 pages that basically the question is asked to an investor, you know, do you want to undertake the optional investor self-assessment? And that optional investor self-assessment will be actually have 2 aspects to it, basically a comprehension assessment and a suitability assessment. And the comprehension assessment will be certified that by a psychometric tester, that basically the comprehension test questions that are asked should give you a level of assurance that the person who's read the 2 pages actually understands the 2 pages. If you get 2 pages, probably lucky. Sorry, understand that is. So And then basically, the beauty of this system is that it really means, and the investor is then still free to buy the product. But after they complete the assessment, they'll get a result that says, well, you had no idea what you just read, or that this product is extremely dangerous. You should take care. But then the investor is free to still take the decision to buy the product. But basically, it's trying to deal with that paradigm, which I think you're alerting to, which is often people are very keen to buy a product, and then they lose money. They go, I had no idea what I was buying. So I've been trying to come to grips with how we can try and solve that problem, in terms of making them responsible, but also making sure that manufacturers who want to do the right thing and make sure that the right investors buy their product, so that we get a better balance between the two. And we try and tackle that issue, which is comprehension. It's disclosure, and I said very early on, it's about effective. And, it's about comprehension, people understanding the product. So, I do think this goes a long way, and I do think, using the new tools we have with online, because it does mean that if somebody comes to you and says, well, actually, I lost money on your product, you can actually go back to online and say, well, actually, I saw, for example, you didn't do the self-assessment, or you did the self-assessment and said you had no idea and you didn't understand, but you still bought it. So, it's trying to get, but equally on the other side, if an investor loses money and they understood the product and it was suitable, they go, look, I did the assessment, I understood the product was still unsuitable. So I think it's sort of trying to get a better logical balance, and I do think this is where we need to be thinking a lot more, because I think we're all trying to grapple with this problem, which is investor comprehension. What's in that mind that investor is buying? And it's got to be sort of basically tailored to every investor.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, Greg, the concept of sort of testing the quality of the engagement. And really, investor engagement is so important. Responsibility is an element of that. But when you look at, the kind of the long-term savings needs of investors across the globe, you look at the unsustainable promises that have been made in the developed world in terms of long-term savings and pension arrangements. These cannot be replicated for the younger generation. Huge political upheaval as these changes are realized, and the scale of them is realized. In the developing world, you have growing middle classes, aging populations, pension arrangements, the long-term savings not in place or only rudimentary, things being built up all over the globe. The whole underlying premise of that is a responsibility and an engagement of the investor. And the proposition is kind of a scary one, which is you're going to be quite a bit responsible for what happens to you when you're 80 years old, and how well positioned you will be. So the engagement challenge there is massively important. The fund industry has a huge role to play there, and the more effective the engagement and tools like this to help us test it and to use the online environment, great.
All right. We have 2 more minutes. Now, I have a question here, but it's an interesting question, so very quickly. They'd like to have our view on whether or not we would assess a product in terms of whether it's fair by reference to its return. And if so, what would be the objective or subjective standards that we would use?
That's easy. If it's too good to be true, it probably isn't.
Maybe on this one, I think there is a strong link with the intelligibility of the product or the comprehension problem.
Edouard, can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry, it works. No, there is a strong link with what Greg just said on the comprehension by the investor. Because normally the risk-reward profile is something that should be understood because too good to be true, that's okay. In certain circumstances, it's not that easy. And one of the arguments we may have to say that the product is too complex, when it's not possible for the retail investor to make the link between the risk and the reward. And for instance, in certain complex structured products, it may happen. But in France, for instance, we had the example with certain bonds for companies with, I would say, a difficult profile. For instance, it's very difficult for a retail end user, for an investor, to understand what it means to buy a bond with 10% or 8% of return. because the company is in a very specific situation. So I think, again, it comes back to the idea of a risk-reward profile, of the intelligibility of that. And in an ideal world, I love the word that was said or written about misbuying. It's true that there is misbuying. But in an ideal world, what we should have, it's very difficult, is to know when there is misbuying, is whether it's misbuying because of the flawed information or the complexity of the product, which is to some extent the responsibility either of the manufacturer or the distributor and so on, or the information or the prospectus or the KID. And when the misbuying is just because of the risk that was taken, and when it is the case, it's just the individual responsibility of the investors. And the last point, to echo what Dan said, you cannot say that you want an enormous level of protection against the risk in those issues and say at the same time that you want to fund old age, dependency, and retirement schemes. The two are totally opposite. I mean, and there's a strong link with what was said at the first round table. I mean, there is a trade-off between the risk and the reward here too.
All right.
One statement or two.
Sure.
Whatsoever, how good is our analysis or how transparent it is, as a distributor, it will be very lucky if a final investor will not lose his concentration by 30 minutes, whatsoever we want to say. So whatsoever key we want, by the statistic, if you have a customer listen to you for 1 hour,
actually, one thing I didn't mention as part of this project, we're actually going to allow the key fact statement to be delivered by whatever media somebody selects. So we're actually going to enable delivery not just by paper, but by video. So whatever media can best get that message across about the key fact statement. To your point, with somebody buying on an iPhone, their general, as you say, their concentration is far less than 30 minutes, actually. So it is important, too, to think about the medium by which you communicate, because, frankly, paper's finished. So you've got to think about the medium as well. Yeah.
Right, and also, I think a lot now rides on your project, so we stay tuned.
Good.
All right, so
you can watch the video.
I'd like to thank my panel members for a very interesting and in-depth and frank discussion on the topic. So if you would join me to thank them.
Thank you, Alex.